The five poems that Brandy set to music have stories about them, some of them long and some of them not so long. The poem Villanelle, which begins in this year of 2017, was written actually on New Year's Day, 2017, obviously with reference to the election of the previous November. And the Villanelle is a complicated poem form, and doesn't usually happen spontaneously. But in this case, I remember writing the poem almost without stopping. It came out very quickly. Some of my other poems, that's not true for. The poem Asylum, actually, the composition of that poem extends over a period of some 35 years. Sometimes I write two short poems at different times and then discover that they have the same subject and can be combined into one poem. And that's exactly what happened with Asylum. The first poem was written about the crazy professor, was written at one point, and then the second poem was written, I think, about 10 or 15 years earlier. In fact, it's one of the few poems I've ever gotten published in the gay community news back in the 1970s in Boston. And then at some point, I just looked at the two poems and said, these go together, and I slapped them in the poem. The part that is the earlier poem begins, give me some time to band together, we'll find the others. And then from that point on, it's a poem that I wrote at a different time. The poem Xenophilia is the final version of a poem that went through a lot of stages. It was originally written about my fascination with Eastern Europe. I spent a lot of time there in the 1980s. And one of the things that disturbed me about my interest in Eastern Europe was that one of the reasons I liked it was that it was so different from the United States, and yet not so different that I couldn't find any kind of connection. Sort of a borderline between me and a completely different world. And on one level, I felt that it was inappropriate to be interested in a culture simply because it was different from my own culture. I should be interested in it for its own right. And the original version of the poem was about why I thought it was okay and not okay to be interested in Hungarian culture. And actually the only thing I saved from the actual poem was the title. The poem The Silence of Time is a poem that has a lot to do with my interest during the past 2 years in the philosophy of Immanuel Kant. One of the things that Kant indicates in his philosophy, and it's something that Arthur Schopenhauer picks up on, Schopenhauer is another philosopher I admire a lot, is that things don't exist passively in the moment. The existence of a thing is determined by the fact that it exists from moment to moment. Things exist in an active sense. And if they do not exist in ongoing time, they don't exist at all. And the idea of the silence of time progresses somehow from that. The first line, darkness is visible silence, simply popped into my head as I was working on a novel. And I stopped working on the novel in order to write the poem, which was another one of those poems that came out of my head in a half hour. And after the poem was finished, I realized that the poem was actually about a dead ex-lover, whom I was also writing about in the novel, although I didn't realize at the time that the poem was about the same person that the novel was. So the idea that if time ceases, people cease to be, is about the fact that my ex-lover was dead at the time that I wrote the poem. And also it has to do with Kant's conception of time as determining existence, and the idea that if there were no time, there would be no existence of anything. Finally, there's that poem As Is, which I just sort of wrote one day. I don't even remember why. So that's what I have to say about them.